North Atlantic wind carried the smell of rust and salt, a metallic bite that clung to everything it touched. Lieutenant Iris Cordelia Ashford stood at the starboard rail of the USS General Meade. Her Army uniform jacket buttoned tight against the cold, watching the gray swells rise and fall beneath an equally gray sky. The ship's engines thudded in a slow, deliberate rhythm. One heartbeat for every mile gained westward, carrying 60 German generals toward an enemy shore they had never imagined seeing as prisoners. May 1945. The war in Europe had ended 3 weeks ago, but the journey was far from over. Iris pressed her gloved hand against the telegram folded in her breast pocket. She had memorized every word weeks ago, but the paper itself had become something else now. A relic, a wound that wouldn't close. The words were efficient military, devoid of anything that might resemble comfort. We regret to inform you that Captain Nathaniel Thomas Ashford was killed in action on January 16, 1945, during operations in the Ardennes region of Belgium. He died serving his country with honor and distinction. Nathaniel, 31 years old, her only sibling, dead in the snow and chaos of the Battle of the Bulge while she had been safe at an intelligence desk in Washington translating intercepted German communications that arrived too late to save anyone. And now she stood on a ship full of the men who had given the orders that killed him. Below deck, confined to officers' quarters that had been repurposed as a floating prison, were 60 of the Wehrmacht's highest-ranking officers. Generals and colonels who had commanded divisions, orchestrated campaigns, directed the machinery of total war. Men who wore defeat-like, ill-fitting clothes, their gray uniforms stripped of insignia, their faces hollowed by months of captivity and the slow collapse of everything they had believed. Iris had been assigned to them as their translator. Fluent in German thanks to a childhood spent in her father's study surrounded by Goethe and Schiller and Heine, she was to be their voice in a country that did not speak their language. She was to listen to their conversations, report their attitudes, translate their questions and complaints and quiet moments of despair to the American officers who now controlled their fate. The assignment had come through 2 weeks ago. Captain Silas Whitmore of Army Intelligence had delivered it personally, standing in the cramped office she shared with 3 other translators at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. "You'll accompany the prisoner transport from dock to final destination," he had said, his voice carrying the flat efficiency of a man who had delivered 1,000 such orders. 60 German officers, High Command. We're bringing them stateside for debriefing. Extended interrogation. You'll translate, document, observe. She had looked at him, the telegram still fresh in her pocket, and felt something cold settle in her chest. "I lost my brother in January," she had said quietly. "Ardennes, is that going to be a problem?" Whitmore had studied her for a long moment. His eyes were gray sharp, the kind that missed very little. "Only if you let it be," he had finally said. "We need you, professional lieutenant, not vengeful. Can you do that?" She had given him the only answer a soldier could give. "Yes, sir." But standing here now, salt wind stinging her eyes, watching the ocean churn beneath a sky that looked like gunmetal, Iris wondered if she had lied. Could she translate for the enemy without her voice shaking? Could she listen to them justify the war that had killed Nathaniel and maintain the cool professionalism expected of an intelligence officer? Could she stand in the same room with men who might have signed the orders drawn? The maps directed the artillery that ended her brother's life and not let hatred color every word that passed through her. She didn't know, but she would find out soon enough. The questions circled in her mind like gulls over a fishing boat, relentless and hungry. Would she be able to keep her composure when she heard them speak of the war as though it had been noble? Did they truly believe the propaganda they had been fed about America collapsing cities, burning democracy, eating itself alive? What would happen when they saw New York Harbor intact, gleaming utterly untouched by the devastation that had reduced Berlin to ash? Which of them would be the first to crack to let doubt seep through the armor of ideology? How would she react when they tried to explain themselves, to claim they were only following orders, only doing their duty? Did any of them have family waiting for them in the ruins of Germany, or had the war taken from them as it had taken from her? And years from now, when she was old and this ship was nothing but a memory, what would she remember most about these men who had been her enemies? The questions had no answers yet, but they would. Every mile westward brought her closer to understanding, or perhaps closer to a rage she wasn't sure she could control. The first time Iris descended into the prisoners' quarters, the smell hit her before anything else. 60 men confined in close spaces, even with adequate ventilation, created an atmosphere of sweat and wool and the peculiar staleness of human anxiety. The converted officer cabins had been stripped of any luxury furnished now, with simple bunks and a few tables where the generals gathered during the limited hours they were permitted out of their individual cells. Captain Whitmore had assigned her a small desk in an observation room, with a one-way window overlooking the main common area. From here she could watch and listen without being seen, though she would need to be present for formal interviews and translation duties. On her second day aboard, Whitmore brought her into the common room to begin her work. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward her as she entered. Some were curious, others were cold. A few looked simply exhausted men who had stopped caring who watched them, or what happened next. At the center table sat 3 men who clearly commanded respect among the others. Iris had reviewed their files until she could recite their service records from memory. General Matthias von Brenner, 52 years old, former commander of the 7th Panzer Division. Tall, lean, with gray hair, cut military short, and eyes that seemed to calculate even when resting. He had surrendered his 15,000 men near the Rhine in April without a fight, recognizing that further resistance was suicide. Married, 1 daughter, Elizabeth, whereabouts unknown since the bombing of Dresden. General Klaus Reinhardt, 50 years old, decorated staff officer who had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. Broader in build, with a face that looked carved from granite and hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. Wife and 2 sons last reported in Munich. No contact since February. Colonel Dietrich Vogel, 48 years old, a true believer who wore his loyalty to National Socialism like a badge. Shorter than the others, compact and intense, with eyes that burned with conviction even now. He had protested his surrender had to be physically restrained by his own men when the order came to lay down arms. Unmarried. No family that anyone knew of. His allegiance was to the cause, not to people. Von Brenner was speaking when Iris entered, his voice low but carrying easily in the confined space. He spoke in German, of course, not yet knowing that she understood every word. America ist im Chaos, he said, addressing Reinhardt and 2 other generals whose names Iris hadn't memorized yet. Die Städte brennen. Sie brauchen uns als Trophäen, als Symbole ihres Sieges. America is in chaos. The cities burn. They need us as trophies, as symbols of their victory. Reinhardt nodded slowly, but there was something uncertain in his expression. A flicker of doubt that von Brenner seemed not to notice. Und wenn nicht, Reinhardt asked quietly, was wenn sie uns die Wahrheit zeigen wollen? And if not, what if they want to show us the truth? Vogel, sitting to von Brenner's left, made a sound of disgust. Es gibt keine Wahrheit außer der, die wir bereits kennen, he said sharply. Die Dekadenz der Demokratie, die Schwäche der Alliierten, sie können uns nicht brechen, sie werden es versuchen und scheitern. There is no truth except what we already know, the decadence of democracy, the weakness of the Allies. They cannot break us, they will try and fail. Iris felt Whitmore's eyes on her, waiting for the translation. She cleared her throat and 60 heads turned again. Her voice came out cooler than she felt. General von Brenner believes we're bringing them to America as trophies, that our cities are in chaos. General Reinhardt expressed doubt. Colonel Vogel insists their ideology cannot be broken. Whitmore nodded his face, revealing nothing. He had heard worse. Tell them, he said to Iris, that they will have an opportunity to observe American conditions firsthand. No propaganda, just evidence. What they choose to believe afterward is their own business. Iris translated, keeping her tone neutral, professional. She watched their faces as comprehension settled in. Von Brenner's expression remained carefully blank. Reinhardt's doubt deepened. Vogel's jaw tightened with defiance. When the translation was complete, von Brenner spoke again this time, directing his words at Iris in accented but clear English. "You speak our language very well, Lieutenant. Where did you learn?" She met his eyes and felt Nathaniel's ghost standing beside her. "My father was a professor of German literature," she said. "I grew up reading Goethe and Rilke, before the war made that complicated." Something shifted in von Brenner's face. Not quite shame, but an acknowledgement of loss, of things ruined. "Ja," he said quietly, "before the war." Over the following days, Iris settled into the strange rhythm of the voyage. She observed the generals during their common hours, noting their conversations, their hierarchies, the fault lines that ran through their group like cracks in old porcelain. She noticed that von Brenner kept something tucked inside his uniform pocket, something he touched occasionally when he thought no one was watching. A handkerchief, she eventually realized, with embroidered edges. White linen with the letter E stitched in blue thread. He would unfold it sometimes late at night when the others had returned to their cells, running his thumb over the stitching as though reading Braille. She noticed that Vogel held secret meetings with the younger, more fervent officers, gatherings that happened in corners and alcoves when supervision was minimal. Iris couldn't always hear what was said, but the intensity was unmistakable. Vogel was organizing something. Resistance, maybe, or at least the preservation of belief. She noticed that Reinhardt spent hours staring at the ocean through the small portholes, his lips moving in silent words. Once she positioned herself close enough to hear what he was saying. "Meine Frau," he whispered to the waves. "Meine Söhne, liebt ihr noch? My wife, my sons, are you still alive?" These observations went into her daily reports to Whitmore, but they also went somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't expected. Into the part of her that had been carefully constructed to hate these men without complication, to see them as the enemy, pure and simple architects of the machine that had killed her brother. They were still that, but they were also becoming something else, three-dimensional, human in their grief and uncertainty. It made everything harder. On the 14th day at sea, just before dawn, the call came through the ship's intercom. "All prisoners topside. Repeat, all prisoners topside for processing." Iris was already awake. She had been for hours standing at her observation post, watching the sky begin to pale in the east. She knew what this meant. Land. She followed Whitmore and the armed guards as they herded the 60 generals up narrow stairways and through hatches. Boots scraping on steel, the sound of men emerging from darkness into light. The deck was crowded and cold. Salt mist hung in the air like a veil. The generals assembled in rough formation, their gray uniforms dark with moisture, their faces turned east towards something they couldn't yet see. The fog was thick, impenetrable. They stood in silence, waiting, and then slowly, as though the world itself was being revealed for the first time, the mist began to part. Iris watched their faces as New York Harbor unfurled before them. It was not ruins. It was radiance. The skyline rose like a monument to everything they had been told was impossible. Towers of glass and stone sharp against the rising sun, utterly untouched by war. Cranes moved like giants along the waterfront, lifting cargo as though nothing extraordinary had happened in the past 6 years. Ferries streamed wake ribbons across the water. Freight barges heavy with coal slipped beneath bridges that gleamed in the morning light. The city looked impossibly defiantly alive. Iris heard the sound before she understood what it was. A collective inhalation. 60 men drawing breath at the same moment, shock making the air thin. Von Brenner stood at the rail, his hands gripping the cold metal, knuckles white. His lips moved, forming words that barely escaped as sound. "Das ist unmöglich. This is impossible. Beside him, Reinhardt's legs seemed to give out. He sank to his knees on the deck, his mouth open, tears streaming down his weathered face. Gott im Himmel, he whispered. Sie haben uns belogen. Sie haben uns alle belogen. God in heaven. They lied to us. They lied to all of us. Even Vogel, the true believer, stood rigid with something that looked like horror. His world, built on propaganda and certainty, was cracking before his eyes. Iris stood apart from them, watching this moment of collective disillusionment, and felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not satisfaction, not the triumph she thought she might feel seeing these men confronted with the evidence of their defeat. Pity. They had crossed an ocean believing they were traveling to a broken nation, a democracy consuming itself. They had clung to that belief like a life raft, the last piece of certainty in a world that had collapsed around them. And now, standing on the deck of an American ship in an American harbor, looking at an American city that had never known bombardment, never known hunger, never known the terror of sirens screaming overhead, they understood. They had lost more than the war, they had lost the truth. Whitmore stood beside Iris, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the generals with the clinical interest of a scientist observing an experiment. "This is why we brought them here," he said quietly, speaking just to her. "Not for punishment, for education." Iris nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hand moved unconsciously to her breast pocket, to the telegram that never left her. Nathaniel would never see this, would never know that the enemy he died fighting against had been undone not by bullets, but by the simple, overwhelming evidence of American abundance. She didn't know if that made his death more or less sensible. The ship moved slowly into dock, guided by tugboats and the practiced efficiency of a harbor that had welcomed 1,000 such arrivals. The smell changed as they drew closer to land. The metallic sweetness of oil, roasted coffee from warehouses along the waterfront, the faint trace of baking bread carried on the morning breeze. Civilization had an aroma that none of these men had inhaled in years. Von Brenner turned to Iris. His face was gray, his eyes hollow with something beyond exhaustion. "Lieutenant," he said in English, his voice barely above a whisper, "is this real, or is this what you want us to see?" She looked at him, this general who had commanded 15,000 men, who had made decisions that sent soldiers to their deaths, who had believed in a cause that now lay in ruins. "It's real," she said. "All of it." He closed his eyes as though the truth physically hurt. The disembarkation was orderly, efficient, and utterly without ceremony. No cheering crowds, no angry mobs. Just American soldiers and dock workers going about their business with the same professional indifference they might show to cargo being unloaded. Iris walked with the column of Generals Whitmore at her side as they descended the gangway onto solid ground for the first time in 2 weeks. The wooden planks of the dock vibrated faintly from the cranes moving freight nearby. The air was thick with the sounds of industry, shouting stevedores, diesel engines, the clang of metal on metal, and through it all the city rose in the background, shimmering through industrial haze. The generals were loaded into canvas-topped transport trucks, 10 men per vehicle with armed guards stationed at the rear. Iris climbed into the lead truck with Whitmore and 4 of the senior officers, including Von Brenner and Reinhardt. As the convoy began to move through the streets of Lower Manhattan, Iris watched the Germans' faces. They stared through the open sides of the truck like children seeing so for the first time. Every window that glinted with light, every storefront filled with goods, every ordinary civilian going about an ordinary day seemed to strike them with fresh disbelief. Von Brenner's hands rested on his knees, but his fingers moved constantly, rubbing together as though trying to process something that defied processing. They passed a grocery store with fruit piled in the window, apples and oranges catching the sunlight. A woman in a yellow dress stood outside, holding a small child's hand, both of them laughing about something Iris couldn't hear. All 4 generals turned to watch as the truck passed. It was the normalcy that seemed to destroy them. Not the grand monuments or the impressive architecture, but the small, undeniable evidence that life here continued untouched. That people ate well, dressed well, smiled without fear. Reinhardt spoke in German, his voice thick with something Iris couldn't quite name. Haben wir das gekämpft? He asked von Brenner. Haben wir das zu zerstören versucht? Did we fight this? Did we try to destroy this? Von Brenner didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried a weight that made Iris's chest tighten. Ja, he said simply. Und wir haben nie verstanden, was wir bekämpften. Yes, and we never understood what we were fighting against. Iris translated for Whitmore, who nodded once and wrote something in his notebook. The convoy continued north through the city, then across bridges and through tunnels, following roads that seemed impossibly smooth compared to the bombed-out tracks that served as highways in Germany now. After an hour, they reached their destination, Fort Hunt, Virginia. A complex of low barracks nestled among oak trees surrounded by wire fencing, but looking more like a college campus than a prison. The trucks stopped. The engines cut. Guards began organizing the prisoners into processing lines. A colonel stepped forward, gray-haired and ramrod straight, his uniform crisp despite the humid afternoon. He looked over the assembled Germans with an expression that revealed nothing, then spoke in a voice designed to carry. Welcome to the United States, gentlemen. The translator beside him, an older man with thick glasses, began to render the words into German. But Iris stepped forward. I'll handle this, sir, she said quietly to the colonel. He nodded and stepped back. Iris turned to face the 60 men standing in formation before her. Their gray uniforms rumpled from travel, their faces marked by 2 weeks at sea and the shock of what they had seen this morning. She took a breath and felt Nathaniel beside her again. Not angry now, just watching, waiting to see what she would do. Willkommen in den Vereinigten Staaten, meine Herren, she said, her voice steady and clear. Welcome to the United States, gentlemen. The words hung in the humid Virginia air. Some of the generals shifted uncomfortably. Others stood frozen as though the phrase itself was incomprehensible. Von Brenner was watching her. Their eyes met, and for a moment Iris saw not an enemy, not a war criminal, not the architect of her brother's death. Just a man standing on foreign soil, welcomed when he had expected condemnation, and not knowing what that meant. The colonel gestured toward the barracks. Escort them to quarters, he said to the guards. Get them settled. First meal at 1800 hours. As the Germans were led away, Whitmore touched Iris's elbow, drawing her aside. How are you holding up? He asked. It was the first time he had asked anything personal since this assignment began. Iris looked toward the barracks where von Brenner and the others were disappearing through doorways, entering a new phase of captivity that looked nothing like the cages they had expected. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me again when I've heard them try to justify everything. Whitmore nodded. Fair enough. But for what it's worth, Lieutenant, you're doing exactly what we need. Observing, translating, not judging. That's harder than it sounds. He was right. It was harder. Because with every hour, with every conversation she overheard, with every moment of shock and grief and confusion she witnessed in these men who had been her enemies, the clear lines she had drawn in her mind were beginning to blur. And Iris wasn't sure if that made her a better soldier or a worse one. The first meal at Fort Hunt was served in a dining hall that smelled of fresh coffee and baking bread. Long tables had been set with plain metal trays, but the food itself was almost obscene in its abundance. Roast beef, boiled potatoes, green beans, fresh milk, bread so recently baked that steam still rose when it was cut. Iris stood at the edge of the hall with Whitmore and 2 other officers watching as the 60 generals filed in and took their seats. Their expressions ranged from confusion to suspicion to something close to anguish. Vogel, the Nazi loyalist, stood at his place and refused to sit. Dies ist Demütigung, he said loudly in German, his voice carrying through the hall. Sie erniedrigen uns mit dieser Lüge. This is humiliation. You degrade us with this lie. Several of the younger officers looked at him uncertain. Vogel had influence. His defiance could spread. But von Brenner, seated at the center table, picked up his fork. Setz dich, Dietrich, he said quietly. Es ist kein Trick. Es ist einfach, was Sie haben. Sit down, Dietrich. It's not a trick. It's simply what they have. Vogel glared at him, but after a long moment he sat. Iris watched as the generals began to eat. Most did so mechanically, as though their bodies required fuel, but their minds couldn't process the contradiction of eating better as prisoners than they had as free men in the final months of the war. Von Brenner ate slowly, methodically. But halfway through the meal, Iris saw his hand stop. The fork trembled. A tear fell onto his tray, darkening the edge of the bread. After the meal, when the others had been escorted back to their quarters, Iris found von Brenner sitting alone in a small courtyard between buildings. He held a piece of paper in his hands, thin and worn as though it had been read many times. He didn't seem surprised when she approached. "A letter from my wife," he said in English, not looking up. "It arrived before I left France. The Red Cross delivered it." Iris knew she should leave him to his privacy, but something made her stay. "What does she say?" she asked quietly. Von Brenner's thumb traced the edge of the paper. "She says Elizabeth, my daughter, is down to 41 kilograms. She says they have had no flour for 6 weeks. She says she prays I am alive, but she does not know if prayer still works in a world like this." He folded the letter carefully, precisely, and returned it to his pocket. Then he withdrew the handkerchief, the one with the embroidered E that Iris had seen him touch so many times. "My wife made this," he said, "before the war, when we still believed in things like embroidered handkerchiefs and Sunday dinners and children who grew up strong." He looked at Iris, then really looked at her, and his eyes were full of something she recognized because she carried it herself. "Grief. I just ate roast beef," he said, his voice breaking. "My wife eats potato peels, my daughter starves, and I sit in comfort because I lost a war that should never have been fought." Iris felt her throat tighten. This was the enemy, the man whose orders, whose allegiance to a regime of horror had helped create the machinery that killed Nathaniel. She should feel nothing for him but contempt. But standing there in the Virginia twilight, watching him hold his wife's handkerchief like a holy relic, she felt something else entirely. She felt the terrible, complicated weight of shared humanity. Lieutenant von Brenner said, not looking at her now, speaking to the handkerchief in his hands. "You lost your brother. I saw it in your eyes when you first came to the ship. I have lost men too, thousands of them. I sent them to die for lies." He folded the handkerchief, slowly returning it to the pocket over his heart. "Perhaps we are both victims," he said, "of the same machine. Does that make you angry?" Iris thought about Nathaniel, about the telegram, about standing here translating for a German general who wept for his starving family, while her own family would never be whole again. "Yes," she said finally. "It makes me furious because it means there's no one simple thing to hate." Von Brenner nodded slowly as though she had confirmed something he already knew. "Ja," he said, "that is the curse of truth. It refuses to be simple." Night fell over Fort Hunt. The barracks lights came on. Somewhere in the distance, Iris heard American soldiers laughing about something, their voices carrying across the compound like echoes from a different world. She left von Brenner sitting in the courtyard and walked back to her quarters, the questions in her mind multiplying with every step. Could she translate for these men without letting compassion soften her understanding of what they had done? Could she maintain the professional distance required of an intelligence officer, when every conversation revealed new depths of human complexity? Could she honor Nathaniel's memory while acknowledging the humanity of the men who had fought on the other side? She didn't have answers, but tomorrow she would sit across from von Brenner and Reinhardt and the others again. She would translate their words, document their thoughts, observe their slow transformation from soldiers into something else. And perhaps in the process she would be transformed too. Whether that was what she wanted, she didn't yet know. But it was happening anyway. The interrogation room at Fort Hunt was smaller than Iris had expected. A single table, 3 chairs, one window with bars that let in slanted afternoon light. The walls were painted institutional beige, the kind of color designed to reveal nothing and inspire even less. Iris sat in the corner with her notebook and pencil positioned to observe both Captain Whitmore and whatever prisoner he was questioning. Her role was simple in theory. Listen, translate when needed, document everything. In practice, it was becoming something far more complicated. The daily routine had established itself with military precision. Each morning at 0700 breakfast, at 0800 the first interrogation session. They would continue throughout the day in 2-hour blocks, breaking only for meals and the mandatory exercise period when the generals were allowed to walk the compound's perimeter under guard. Whitmore had a method. He never raised his voice, never threatened, never even implied that cooperation would improve conditions because the conditions were already better than most of these men had experienced in years. Instead, he asked questions with genuine curiosity, as though he were a student learning from a professor rather than a victor interrogating the vanquished. It was devastatingly effective. On the 9th day at Fort Hunt, von Brenner was brought in for his 3rd session. He entered with the same careful dignity he brought to everything, nodded to Whitmore, acknowledged Iris with a slight inclination of his head, and sat. Whitmore spread several maps across the table. Tactical maps of the Eastern Front showing supply lines and troop movements from 1943. General, Whitmore began, his tone conversational, I've been studying your logistics operations during the winter campaign. The way you managed to keep your division supplied across those distances in those conditions. It's remarkable. Von Brenner looked at the maps, something shifting in his expression. Pride, perhaps. Or maybe just muscle memory from a time when such skills had mattered. You study our methods, he asked in English. We study everything, Whitmore replied. The war is over, General. We're not enemies anymore. We're historians trying to understand what happened. Von Brenner's eyes narrowed slightly, searching for the trap in those words. Finding none, he leaned forward and began to explain, his finger tracing routes on the map, his voice taking on the cadence of a teacher. Iris translated the technical terms he occasionally lapsed into German to express. Durchbruch, Kesselschlacht, Schwerpunkt, words that had defined the way Europe burned. 20 minutes into the explanation, Whitmore interrupted gently. Your systems were genius, General, but I noticed something. Here and here and here. He pointed to 3 different positions on the map. You were wound too tight, like a clock with too much tension on the spring. One break anywhere and the whole mechanism fails. Von Brenner sat back slowly. Iris watched his face process what Whitmore had just done. Not criticized, analyzed, as an equal. You, Von Brenner paused, searching for words. You respect my work. I respect competence, Whitmore said simply. I respect the complexity of what you attempted. The war is over, General. Now we need to understand, not defeat. Silence filled the small room. Iris could hear her own breathing, the scratch of her pencil on paper, the distant sound of men drilling in the yard outside. Von Brenner looked at Whitmore with something Iris had not yet seen in any of the prisoners. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that he was being treated as a human being rather than a trophy. The Wehrmacht was built on precision, Von Brenner said, finally, his voice quiet. But precision becomes brittle when reality refuses to cooperate. We calculated for every variable except the one that mattered most. Which was, Whitmore asked. That we were wrong. Iris wrote those words in her notebook, underlining them twice. Later she would include them in her report. But in the moment she felt something shift inside herself. This was not the arrogant general who had spoken on the ship about American chaos. This was a man confronting the collapse of everything he had built his life around, and she was watching it happen in real time. After the session ended and Von Brenner was escorted back to his quarters, Whitmore turned to Iris. Your thoughts, Lieutenant? Iris set down her pencil. He's cracking, not breaking, cracking, like ice in spring. Good, Whitmore said. That's exactly what we need. Men who crack can be rebuilt. Men who break just shatter into pieces no one can use. Iris understood the logic, but she couldn't help feeling like she was watching something that should be private. A man's ideology dying in front of witnesses. That night, she wrote in her own private journal, the one that wouldn't be filed in any official report. I hate that I'm beginning to care whether von Brenner survives this transformation intact. He should be just another subject to document. Instead, I find myself hoping Whitmore's method works, that these men can be saved from themselves. Does that make me a bad sister? Would Nathaniel understand? The reports Iris filed each evening noted a different kind of resistance developing among the prisoners. Vogel, the true believer, had not cracked or even begun to crack. If anything, his certainty had calcified. She observed him during the common hours, watching as he gathered the younger officers, the ones who still wore their defeat, like a temporary setback rather than a final verdict. They would cluster in corners of the exercise yard, voices low but intense. Iris couldn't always hear what was said, but she knew organization when she saw it. One afternoon, she reported her observations to Whitmore. Vogel is conducting what amounts to a shadow command structure, she said. He's maintaining ideological discipline among approximately 15 of the younger prisoners. They're holding some kind of loyalty vote, testing who still believes. How many? Whitmore asked. Based on what I've overheard, roughly 23 out of 60, just under 40%. Whitmore made a note. Let him. We don't change minds by suppression, Lieutenant. We change them by evidence. Let Vogel maintain his certainty for now. It makes the contrast sharper when reality finally breaks through. But Iris wondered if Whitmore was being naive. Some beliefs she knew ran deeper than evidence could reach. 3 days later, Whitmore brought a book to von Brenner's interrogation session. Not a military manual, not a technical document, a worn copy of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. He set it on the table between them. General, you mentioned your interest in philosophy before the war. I thought you might find this interesting. Von Brenner looked at the book as though it might explode. I cannot read English well enough for literature, he said. Whitmore glanced at Iris. Lieutenant Ashford reads beautifully. Perhaps she could help. And that was how Iris found herself 20 minutes later reading Emerson's Self-Reliance aloud in the small interrogation room, while a German general listened with an expression of growing wonder and horror. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. She read, her voice steady and clear. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Von Brenner held up his hand. Stop, please, again. Iris read the passage again, more slowly this time. She watched his face as the words landed, as their meaning sank through years of conditioning that had taught the opposite. That had demanded conformity as the highest virtue, that had made individuality a sin against the collective. When she finished, von Brenner sat in silence for a long moment. This is what you teach, he finally asked Whitmore. This refusal to conform, it's what we value, Whitmore replied. The right to think for yourself, to question authority, to explore whether what you've been told is goodness actually is goodness. Von Brenner's hands were shaking. Iris noted it in her report that evening, but she also noted something else. The way he had asked to hear the passage again, the way his eyes had closed as she read, as though the words were both painful and necessary. That night, von Brenner requested permission to keep the book. Whitmore granted it, and Iris realized she was witnessing something she hadn't expected. Not just the defeat of an army, but the slow, painful education of men who had never been taught to think for themselves. Summer arrived in Virginia with humidity that turned the air to soup. The generals adapted to their routine. Work details in the camp gardens, language classes for those who wanted to improve their English, recreation time, meals that continued to be almost absurdly abundant compared to what letters from Germany described. In mid-June, orders came through for a transfer. 60 generals was too many for Fort Hunt's specialized interrogation program. Most would be moved to larger POW camps in the Midwest. Iris would accompany the group designated for Camp Algona in Iowa. Whitmore called her into his office the day before departure. "You've done good work here, Lieutenant. The kind of observation we need. How do you feel about continuing with this assignment?" Iris thought about the question. How did she feel? Exhausted, confused, angry at herself for beginning to see these men as human, guilty for betraying Nathaniel's memory by caring about their transformation. "I'll continue," she said. "That's not what I asked." Iris met his eyes. "I feel like I'm translating more than words, sir. I'm translating one world into another, and I don't know if I'm supposed to be changed by that process or not." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Welcome to intelligence work, Lieutenant. The enemy stops being simple the moment you actually listen to them." The train journey west began on a morning that promised heat. 2 Pullman-style passenger cars had been configured for prisoner transport. Comfortable seats, windows that opened, guards stationed at intervals but not oppressively present. Iris had her own compartment, small but private, with a view of the countryside that would unspool over the next 2 days. The generals boarded in orderly fashion. Von Brenner, Reinhardt, and 18 others in the first car, Vogel and his followers in the second. The separation was deliberate. Whitmore's final instruction had been clear. "Let the believers and the doubters travel separately. See what conversations develop when they're not performing for each other." As the train pulled out of the station, Iris moved through the cars with her notebook, observing, listening, documenting. The landscape changed gradually. Virginia's green hills gave way to the flatter expanse of Ohio. Cities became towns, became farmland, and with each mile Iris watched the Germans' faces register new shock. The Mississippi River crossing took 30 minutes, the train moving slowly across a bridge that seemed to stretch forever. Von Brenner stood at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, staring down at the water. "So straight," he murmured in German. "Wie ist das möglich?" "How is this possible?" Reinhardt, sitting nearby, answered in the same language. "They built an empire on geometry, on certainty, on the belief that tomorrow would be better than today." "And we built one on myth," Von Brenner replied quietly. Through Illinois they passed combines harvesting wheat machines so large they looked like something from a different century. The fields stretched to every horizon, golden and abundant, tended by farmers who waved occasionally at the passing train without curiosity or malice. Iris noted the way the generals fell silent watching this, the way abundance seen from a distance became accusation. At a small station in Indiana, the train stopped to take on water, a 30-minute delay. The guards permitted the prisoners to disembark briefly to stretch legs and breathe air that wasn't recycled through the cars. Iris stepped down onto the platform and immediately smelled summer. Cut grass and diesel fuel and something sweet she couldn't identify. A young woman, maybe 17, had set up a stand near the station. Lemonade 5 cents a glass. Her hair was pulled back in a red scarf, and she wore a dress printed with small flowers. She saw the group of men in prison uniforms and guards, and her smile didn't falter. "Lemonade," she called out. "Fresh made this morning." One of the guards bought a round for his squad, but the girl kept looking at the prisoners with simple curiosity. Reinhardt, standing near Iris, watched the girl with an expression that made Iris's chest tighten. "Entschuldigung," he said quietly to the guard nearest him. "Excuse me, may I purchase?" The guard looked at Iris. She nodded. Reinhardt approached the stand with the careful movements of a man entering a church. He held out the few coins he'd been given as labor payment, his hand shaking. The girl poured lemonade into a paper cup and handed it to him with a smile that contained no judgment, no hatred, no knowledge of what he had been or done. "It's awful hot today," she said cheerfully. "This should help." Reinhardt took the cup, stared at it, at her, at the casual kindness in her eyes, and began to cry. Not quiet tears, deep wrenching sobs that bent him forward, one hand pressed against the lemonade stand for balance while the other held the cup like it contained something holy. The girl's smile faded into concern. "Mister, are you okay?" Iris stepped forward, her voice gentle. "He's fine. It's just, he hasn't been offered kindness in a very long time." The girl looked at Reinhardt's uniform, understanding dawning. "Oh, you're from the war?" "Yes," Iris said. The girl thought for a moment, then poured another cup and handed it to Iris. "Then he probably needs two." Iris took the second cup and gave it to Reinhardt, who couldn't speak, could only nod his gratitude while tears ran down his weathered face. Later, back on the train, as the landscape rolled past, Iris sat across from Reinhardt in the dining car. He had composed himself, but his eyes remained red. "She smiled at me," he said in German, knowing Iris would understand. "She did not know what I was, what I have done. She just smiled and gave me lemonade." "Yes," Iris said. "In Germany in the last year, no one smiled. No one had anything to give. We became animals fighting over scraps." His voice broke again. "And here a girl selling lemonade treats me like a human being." Iris thought about all the translations she had done, all the words she had moved from one language to another. But this moment needed no translation, only witness. "Do you still believe what Vogel believes?" she asked quietly. "That this is weakness, decadence?" Reinhardt looked out the window at America passing by, rich and whole and generous. "No," he said. "I think we called it weakness because we were terrified of it, terrified of a strength we did not understand." That evening, as the train moved through the darkness toward Iowa, mail call came. Letters had been forwarded from Fort Hunt, Red Cross deliveries from Germany. Von Brenner received one. Iris watched from her compartment as he opened it with hands that trembled, watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from his skin. She found him later in the observation car, empty now except for him and the night beyond the windows. "Your wife?" she asked. He nodded, not looking at her. "Dresden was bombed again in April. She and Elizabeth hid in a cellar for 3 days. When they emerged, their building was gone. Everything. They are alive, living with strangers, eating 1 meal a day of bread and ersatz coffee." He held up the letter. "She asks if I am eating, if the Americans feed me." The contrast hung between them enormous and obscene. Von Brenner had eaten roast chicken for dinner, with vegetables and pie, while his wife and daughter shared bread among strangers in the ruins of their city. "I told you I lost my brother," Iris said quietly. "In January, Battle of the Bulge." Von Brenner turned to look at her finally. "I know. I see it in how you look at us, as though we are personally responsible. Aren't you?" The question sat heavy in the air. The train rocked gently beneath them, carrying them both toward destinations neither had chosen. "Yes," Von Brenner said finally. "I am responsible. I followed orders I should have questioned. I believed lies I should have examined. I commanded men in service of evil I told myself was necessity." He folded the letter carefully. "Your brother died fighting against that. My wife and daughter starved because of it. We are all victims and all perpetrators. War makes no clean distinctions." Iris felt Nathaniel's ghost beside her again. But this time she thought she understood something new. Nathaniel hadn't died to make her hate. He had died hoping the world might learn better. "Lieutenant," Von Brenner said, "you and I are enemies, but we share something now. The knowledge that war destroys both sides, just differently." Iris nodded, not trusting her voice. Outside the train windows, America rolled past in darkness, whole and untouched and impossibly far from the ruins where Von Brenner's family struggled to survive. And Iris understood finally why Whitmore had wanted her on this assignment, not just to translate words, but to witness the moment when enemies stopped being simple. Camp Algona, Iowa was nothing like Fort Hunt. Larger, more industrial, built to house hundreds of prisoners who worked in the surrounding farms. but the section designated for the generals maintained the same strange gentleness: clean barracks, adequate food, work that was optional rather than forced. Summer became autumn. The generals settled into new routines. Some taught classes in German literature or mathematics to other prisoners. Others worked in the camp gardens growing vegetables they would never taste. Iris continued her work, translating, observing, documenting the slow transformation of men who had commanded armies into men who were learning to question everything they had been taught. And then December arrived, bringing cold and the approach of Christmas. The camp commandant, a colonel named Patterson, believed in the power of humanity. He organized a Christmas celebration for the prisoners. Turkey with all the traditional fixings, decorations, a small tree in the main hall, even gifts donated by local church groups who saw enemy soldiers as human beings in need of kindness. Vogel protested loudly, called it a trick, an attempt to weaken them with false compassion. But most of the generals participated, some because they were hungry for any taste of normalcy. Others because they had begun to believe that maybe kindness wasn't a trick after all. Iris was asked to help translate Christmas carols, to teach the Germans the English words while they taught her the German versions. On Christmas Eve, the main hall was packed. American guards, German generals, local civilians who had volunteered to help with the meal. The piano player, a sergeant from Nebraska, began the opening notes of Silent Night. Iris stood at the front of the hall, the lyrics in both languages written on cards before her. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Von Brenner began, his voice uncertain at first, but growing stronger. Silent night, holy night. The American guards joined in their voices, blending with the German words into something that transcended language. Iris found herself singing both versions at once, switching between languages mid-phrase, and suddenly the tears came. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming strangeness of standing in Iowa in December 1945 singing Christmas carols with men who had been shooting at each other months ago. The song ended. Silence filled the hall, broken only by the sound of grown men trying not to cry. And then the door opened. General Thaddeus Blackwood entered, his uniform crisp despite the cold outside, his silver hair gleaming under the hall lights. He was older than most men in the room, a veteran of the previous war who had served under Patton in this one. The room snapped to attention, American guards saluting, German prisoners standing rigid, uncertain what protocol demanded. Blackwood walked slowly through the hall, his eyes taking in the decorated tree, the tables laden with food, the mixed group of former enemies sharing space. He stopped in front of von Brenner. The two men looked at each other, one who had won, one who had lost, both old enough to remember a time before this war and perhaps wise enough to imagine a time after it. Blackwood spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the silent hall. General von Brenner, we never met on the battlefield. I think it's time we met properly now. He extended his hand. Iris held her breath. This was the moment, the one that would define whether transformation was real or merely performance. Von Brenner looked at the offered hand. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then he reached out and clasped it. The handshake lasted longer than formality required. Two generals, enemies by duty, humans by choice, acknowledging each other across the ruins of ideology. When they released hands, Blackwood spoke again. The war is over, gentlemen. Now comes the harder work. Living with what we've done. Learning from it. Building something better. He nodded to von Brenner, then to the room at large, and took a seat at one of the tables. The hall erupted in motion. Conversations resumed, food was served, Christmas continued. But Iris saw Vogel standing in the corner, his face twisted with disgust and fury. The Nazi loyalist pushed through the crowd and stormed out into the December night. 2 hours later, he tried to escape, made it half a mile from camp before guards found him in a cornfield, frost on his stolen civilian clothes. Defiance still burning in his eyes. He was brought back, placed in isolation, not beaten, not tortured, just separated from the others. Iris was assigned to interview him for her report. She sat across from him in the small holding cell, her notebook ready. Why did you run? She asked in German. Vogel's eyes were hard, unyielding. Because I will not become what they want me to become. I will not betray everything I believe because they feed me well and smile at me. What do you believe? Iris asked. That strength matters, that nations must be pure, that individuals are nothing compared to the collective will. And where did that belief lead? Vogel leaned forward, his voice intense. To greatness, to power, to glory that would have lasted 1,000 years if we had not been betrayed. You weren't betrayed, Iris said quietly. You lost. There's a difference. We were lied to about America, Vogel insisted, but that changes nothing about what is right. Iris looked at this man who still clung to ideology like a drowning man to wreckage, who refused to let evidence change his mind, who would rather break than bend. Colonel Vogel, she said, everyone in this camp has seen the same evidence you have. They've seen American cities intact. They've been treated humanely despite what they did. They've watched guards who lost brothers treat them with respect, and most of them are beginning to question what they believed. Why aren't you? Vogel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Because, Lieutenant, I understand what the others do not. This kindness is not strength. It is weakness, and weakness always fails in the end. You have won this war, but you will lose the next one because you do not have the will to do what is necessary. Iris closed her notebook. I hope you're wrong, she said, for everyone's sake. But as she left the cell, she wondered if Vogel represented something that could never be changed. Some beliefs ran so deep that no amount of evidence could dislodge them. The day after Christmas, Whitmore arrived from Washington for his quarterly inspection. Iris gave him her report in the commandant's office, detailing the progress of each prisoner, noting who was transforming and who remained resistant. Von Brenner is our best case study, she said. Complete ideological shift. He's been reading Emerson, asking questions about democratic theory, even teaching other prisoners about the importance of individual conscience. And Vogel? Whitmore asked. Unchanged. Attempting escape was his way of maintaining ideological purity. He sees kindness as corruption. Whitmore nodded. Some men can't be saved from themselves, but we don't need to save them all, just enough to make a difference when they return home. Sir, Iris said, hesitating. Permission to speak freely. Granted. I came on this assignment hating these men. My brother died fighting them. I wanted to document their defeat, watch them suffer. She paused. But instead I've watched them become human, and I don't know if that makes me a better officer or a worse sister. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. Lieutenant Ashford, your brother died fighting Nazis, not fighting individual Germans. The ideology needed to be defeated. These men, most of them, are learning that. They're becoming witnesses to their own transformation, and you're the one translating that transformation for history. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the camp yard, where generals in prison uniforms were walking the perimeter in the winter sunlight. What you're doing here matters more than you know, he said, because when these men go home, they'll rebuild Germany. And what they rebuild will be shaped by what they learned here, by the kindness they didn't expect, by the strength that didn't require cruelty. Iris looked out the window too. She saw von Brenner and Reinhardt walking together deep in conversation, saw other generals sitting on benches reading books in English, trying to understand this country that had treated them better than their own had. They're ready for the next phase, Whitmore said. Repatriation begins in summer. 6 months from now, they'll return to Germany, to ruins and starvation and a country that needs to be rebuilt from ash. Will they remember what they learned here? Iris asked. Some will, some won't, but the ones who do might change everything. That night, Iris wrote in her journal, Today marks 7 months since Nathaniel died. 7 months since I thought the world made sense, divided cleanly into good and evil, us and them. Now I stand in Iowa translating Christmas carols with German generals and watching enemies become something else, something harder to define. I don't forgive them. I may never forgive them. but I'm beginning to understand them. And understanding, I think, is what Nathaniel would have wanted. Not hatred that lasts forever, but wisdom learned hard. Tomorrow I'll translate more interrogations, document more transformations, watch more men crack open and let new ideas in. And slowly I'm cracking too, letting in the possibility that the enemy was never as simple as I needed them to be. Maybe that's the real translation. Not words from one language to another, but humans from one understanding to another, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Outside her window, snow began to fall on Camp Algona, silent and clean and covering everything with the same white. German prisoners and American guards, barracks and farmland. The whole complicated, impossible experiment in what happens when you treat enemies like humans. And Iris realized she was no longer sure who she had been when this journey started. But she knew with certainty that she would never be that person again. Spring came to Iowa with the smell of turned earth and the sound of tractors moving across fields that stretched to every horizon. The snow melted, revealing ground that had been frozen since November. And with the thaw came news that made the camp fall silent. Repatriation would begin in July. The generals who had spent 14 months in American captivity would return to Germany, to ruins, to starvation, to a country that would need to be rebuilt from ash and memory. Iris received the official notice in April. Her assignment would conclude when the last prisoner boarded the ship at Norfolk. She would file her final reports, return to Washington, and resume whatever normal intelligence work looked like after you had spent more than a year translating the transformation of enemies into something else. The thought of leaving filled her with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Relief, certainly, but also something that felt uncomfortably like loss. In May, Colonel Patterson called Iris to his office. "Lieutenant, I've received approval for a special program. 10 of the generals, those deemed most cooperative and transformed, will be permitted a supervised visit to the town of Algona. Civilian interaction. Give them a chance to see ordinary American life up close before they leave." He slid a list across the desk. Von Brenner's name was at the top. Reinhardt's was second. Vogel's was notably absent. "You'll accompany them as translator," Patterson continued, "along with 4 guards. It's meant to be educational, not punitive. Let them see what they fought against, what they failed to destroy." "Yes, sir," Iris said. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning that smelled of lilac and fresh bread, Iris stood beside a military truck as 10 German generals climbed into the back. They wore their prison uniforms, still the letters PW stenciled on the backs of their shirts, but their faces carried something new. Anticipation, nervousness, the expression of men about to take an exam they hadn't studied for. The drive into Algona took 20 minutes along roads so straight they seemed to prove geometry could tame wilderness. The town appeared gradually rising from the farmland, like something from a postcard. Church steeples, red brick storefronts, a main street wide enough for diagonal parking, American flags hanging from lampposts, not in celebration but in simple permanent declaration. The truck stopped in front of Carmichael's general store. Iris had researched the establishment beforehand, as she researched everything. Family-owned since 1923. Current proprietor, Mrs. Lavinia Carmichael, age 62. Widowed in 1943. One son, Corporal William Joseph Carmichael, killed at Normandy in June 1944, 3 days after the initial invasion. The generals climbed out of the truck, their movements careful, as though the ordinary sidewalk might give way beneath their feet. Citizens of Algona had been notified of the visit, but Iris still saw curtains moving in windows, faces appearing and disappearing. The town watching this strange procession of former enemies walking their streets. Mrs. Carmichael stood outside her store, sweeping the already clean sidewalk. She was smaller than Iris had expected, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a bun and hands marked by decades of work. She wore a simple dress, blue with white flowers, and an apron that said Carmichael's in faded red letters. She saw the group approaching and stopped sweeping. Von Brenner was at the front of the column with Iris at his side. He saw the woman saw something in her expression that made him slow, then stop entirely 3 feet from where she stood. Their eyes met. Time seemed to stretch. Mrs. Carmichael's gaze moved over his prison uniform, taking in the PW letters, understanding exactly what they meant. Her face remained carefully neutral, but Iris saw her grip tighten on the broom handle. Von Brenner nodded with the formal courtesy of a man entering a church. "Ma'am," he said in accented English. Mrs. Carmichael didn't respond immediately. She looked at him, at the 9 other Germans standing behind him, at the American guards, at Iris in her army uniform. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the flat, practical tone of the Midwest. "You boys German?" "Yes, ma'am," Von Brenner replied. "Prisoners?" "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Iris felt the weight of a son who would never come home pressing down on this small woman with her broom and her store and her grief that would last forever. "Well," Mrs. Carmichael finally said, "I suppose you didn't ask to be born German any more than my William asked to die fighting you." Von Brenner's composure cracked slightly. "Ma'am, I cannot express. My wife has also lost. The war took from all sides." Mrs. Carmichael studied him with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by pretty words. "Your wife lose a son?" "No, ma'am, not a child, but she has lost her home, her city, her belief that the world makes sense." The old woman nodded slowly. "Then I reckon we both know about grief." She set the broom against the wall and wiped her hands on her apron. "You want to come in? I got coffee on. Seems foolish to stand out here when there's chairs inside." The invitation hung in the air like something fragile. Iris saw the guards tense, uncertain if this was protocol. Saw the other generals exchange glances, saw Von Brenner's eyes fill with something that looked like gratitude and shame mixed together until they became indistinguishable. "We would be honored, ma'am," he said quietly. Mrs. Carmichael held the door open. "Well then, come on. Coffee's getting cold." The interior of Carmichael's general store smelled of floor wax and penny candy and the coffee that had been percolating since dawn. Shelves lined with canned goods, farming supplies, bolts of fabric. A counter with a cash register that looked older than Iris. Photos on the wall behind it, black and white images of Algona through the decades, and one color photograph in a gold frame. William Joseph Carmichael in his army uniform, young, smiling, alive in a way that existed now only in photographs and memory. Mrs. Carmichael saw Von Brenner looking at the photo. "My son," she said simply. 22 years old, never even got to see France beyond the beach where he died. Von Brenner reached into his pocket and withdrew the handkerchief, the one with the embroidered E that he carried everywhere. "My wife made this," he said, "before the war. I have not seen her in 2 years. She is alive, but I do not know if she will survive what comes next. Germany is broken." Mrs. Carmichael looked at the handkerchief, at the careful stitching, at the love that had gone into every thread. "She got a name, your wife, Elizabeth." The old woman poured coffee into chipped mugs, strong and black, and set them on the counter. "Elizabeth and William," she said. "2 people who probably never met, never even knew the other existed, but they're connected now. Connected by this war that took from both of us." She raised her mug. "To Elizabeth and William, and to whatever world comes next that maybe won't need mothers and wives to bury their children and wait for husbands who might never come home." Von Brenner lifted his mug with shaking hands. The other generals did the same. The guards, Iris. They drank coffee together in a general store in Iowa. Enemies and allies and civilians all bound by the same losses, and Iris felt something shift in the room. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was too simple a word for what this was. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that suffering didn't belong exclusively to one side. After the coffee, Mrs. Carmichael insisted on showing them the town. She walked with surprising energy for a woman her age, pointing out buildings and telling stories, treating the German generals like any other visitors who might be interested in local history. The group arrived at the grain elevator on the edge of town, just as a delivery was being made. The structure rose 30 meters into the bright spring sky, all steel and concrete, purely functional and somehow beautiful because of it. Inside, conveyor belts clattered and hummed, carrying tons of golden corn upward through the building's mechanical heart. The sound was industrial thunder, the smell was dust and grain in abundance. The town engineer, a man named Harold Peterson with hands like leather and a face burned brown by decades of sun, explained the operation with obvious pride. "Feeds cattle, feeds people, feeds exports," he said, his voice raised to carry over the machinery. "This elevator can process 2,000 bushels a day. We grow so much here we're feeding half of Europe." Von Brenner stood looking up at the rivers of grain flowing toward the sky, mechanical and relentless and impossibly rich. Iris watched his face as understanding dawned. "We built cathedrals for power," he said in German, speaking to Reinhardt but loud enough for Iris to hear. "They build them for food." Reinhardt nodded. "We worshipped strength. They worship sustenance. And now we starve while they have so much grain they can export it." Peterson, not understanding the German but reading their expressions, offered his own philosophy. "See the way I figure it," he said. "Power that don't feed people ain't worth spit. You can conquer the whole world, but if your people are hungry, you haven't really built anything. Just made a big loud noise that dies out quick." Iris translated, though she suspected the generals understood enough English by now to grasp the meaning without her help. Von Brenner turned to Peterson and spoke carefully in English. "In Germany we built for glory, for the 1,000-year Reich, for power that would last forever, and it lasted 12 years. This," he gestured to the grain elevator, to the endless fields beyond. "This will last because it serves life, not ideology." Peterson scratched his head, uncomfortable with philosophy, but recognizing truth when he heard it. "Well, I don't know about all that. I just know corn grows whether you're a Nazi or a Democrat or anything else. Land don't care about your politics, just whether you treat it right." The simple wisdom of it seemed to strike Von Brenner harder than any interrogation ever had. The return trip to camp was quiet. The generals sat in the back of the truck watching Iowa pass by, processing what they had seen. A widow who offered coffee to her son's enemies. An engineer who measured success in bushels rather than territory. A town that had lost sons to war and still chose kindness over revenge. That evening, Iris found Von Brenner in the camp library, a small room lined with donated books where prisoners could read during recreation hours. He was writing a letter, his handwriting careful and precise. "And for your wife?" Iris asked. He nodded without looking up. "I want to tell her what I have learned, what America has taught me, but the words feel inadequate." "What would you tell her if words were adequate?" Von Brenner set down his pen. "That I came to this country expecting to measure their weapons and industrial capacity, to document their military strength so that someday, somehow, we might understand how we were defeated." He paused. "Instead, I have measured their conscience and found it stronger than any army." He picked up the pen again, then set it down, unable to continue. "Lieutenant Ashford, in 2 months I will board a ship and return to a country I will not recognize. I will see my wife and daughter starving among ruins. I will watch men like Vogel try to resurrect the old ideology because they cannot admit we were wrong. And I will try to build something new from the ashes of everything I once believed." "What will you build?" Iris asked. "A Germany that serves its people rather than demands they serve it. A military, if there must be one, that answers to civilians rather than rules them. A nation that learns from its defeat rather than pretends it was betrayed." He looked at Iris directly. "You have been my translator for 14 months. You have heard every conversation, documented every transformation. You know what we were and what we are becoming. Do you believe we can succeed?" Iris thought about Nathaniel, about the telegram she still carried, about watching these men crack open and let new light in even when it hurt, even when it destroyed everything they thought they knew. "I believe some of you can," she said finally. "Not all. Vogel will never change. Others will go home and pretend this never happened. But you, General von Brenner, and men like you have the chance to make this suffering mean something." Von Brenner nodded slowly. "Then I will try. For Elizabeth, for my daughter who will grow up in whatever Germany we build, for all the Williams and Nathaniels who died because we failed to see what we were fighting for." He returned to his letter, and Iris left him there writing words that would travel across an ocean to a woman in ruins, carrying news that her husband had been defeated into wisdom. July arrived with heat that turned the air to brass. The orders came through. 60 generals would depart Camp Algona on July 15th. They would travel by train to Norfolk, Virginia. From there, they would board transport ships to Bremerhaven. The final week was a strange kind of limbo. The prisoners packed what few possessions they had accumulated, books mostly, letters, small handmade items they had crafted in woodworking sessions. On the last Sunday, a service was held in the camp chapel. American guards and German prisoners sitting together singing hymns in 2 languages that had learned to harmonize. Iris attended, standing at the back, watching this final gathering of men who had been enemies and become something more complicated. Not friends exactly, but fellow travelers through transformation. After the service, von Brenner approached her. "Lieutenant, I have a request. When we reach Norfolk, before we board the ships, I would like to give you something. Will you accept?" "What is it?" "A burden," he said, "but a necessary one." She agreed without knowing what she was agreeing to. The train journey east reversed the journey west. They had taken 14 months before. The same landscapes passing in opposite directions, but everything different now. The men boarding these trains were not the same men who had arrived. They had been taken apart and reassembled piece by careful piece until their shape remained the same, but their substance had changed entirely. Iris moved through the cars, making her final observations, filing reports that would follow her back to Washington. Noting who had transformed and who had resisted. Documenting the success and failures of this strange experiment in re-education through kindness. She found Reinhardt staring out the window as the Mississippi River came into view again. "I thought of suicide when we first crossed this river," he said in German, not caring if she translated or not. "I could not imagine surviving the shame of defeat, but now I cross it again, and I think perhaps survival is the harder courage. Perhaps living with what we have learned is the real test." "What have you learned?" Iris asked. "That the enemy is never who you think it is. That strength takes many forms. That a girl selling lemonade in Indiana can teach more about power than any general." He smiled sadly. "That I was very stupid for a very long time." 3 days later, they arrived at Norfolk. The port was exactly as Iris remembered it from 14 months ago. Cranes moving against the sky, ships being loaded and unloaded, the smell of ocean and oil, and the busy efficiency of a nation that had won its war and returned to the business of being itself. The generals assembled on the dock in formation one last time, 60 men in prison uniforms, thinner than when they had arrived, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. A young lieutenant distributed their discharge packets, $20 in cash, a certificate of honorable conduct during imprisonment, a Red Cross ration package for the journey home. Von Brenner stood at the head of the formation, accepting his packet with the same dignity he had brought to everything. When the distribution was complete, he asked permission to speak to Lieutenant Ashford privately. They walked to the edge of the dock, away from the others, the water lapping below them with a sound like breathing. "I told you I had a burden to give you," Von Brenner said. He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope thick with multiple pages. "This is a letter. For Elizabeth, in case I do not survive the journey home. The conditions in Germany are uncertain. Disease, starvation, violence. I may not reach Dresden alive." Iris took the envelope, feeling its weight. If I die, the Red Cross will eventually notify her, but they will not be able to tell her what I have learned, what America taught me, what I hope she will teach our daughter. He looked at Iris with eyes that held 14 months of transformation. "You were there, Lieutenant, from the first day on the ship when we saw New York Harbor and could not believe our eyes." To the last day in Iowa when Mrs. Carmichael gave us coffee and treated us as humans rather than monsters. You witnessed everything. I'll make sure she gets it, Iris said. Thank you. Von Brenner paused, searching for words in English that could carry what he needed to say. You lost your brother to this war. I helped create the machine that killed him. There is no apology adequate to that. But I want you to know, Nathaniel did not die for nothing. Because of his sacrifice, because America won, I was brought here. I was shown a better way, and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to build a Germany worthy of the lessons his death taught me. Iris felt tears coming and didn't try to stop them. General von Brenner, when you get home, when you see the ruins and the starvation and all the work that needs to be done, remember this. Remember that strength doesn't require cruelty, that victory can be generous, that the loudest power doesn't need to shout. Von Brenner nodded. Then formally he saluted. Iris returned the salute. They shook hands, German general and American lieutenant, enemy and translator, and something that had no easy name. Other farewells followed. Reinhardt gave Iris the wooden carving he had made in camp, a small oak tree no bigger than her palm, every leaf carved with patient precision. I made this to remember, he said, that even in prison things can grow. Even Vogel, being escorted separately because of his escape attempt and continued resistance, paused as he passed Iris. You think you have won, Lieutenant. You think kindness has defeated ideology. But beliefs deeper than comfort do not die so easily. No, Iris agreed, but they can evolve, if the person holding them is brave enough to let evidence in. Vogel's smile was bitter. I am not brave in that way. I will die believing what I believe. Some of us cannot be saved. I know, Iris said. That's why we focused on the others. The boarding began, 60 generals walking up gangplanks onto ships that would carry them back across an ocean to a continent they had helped destroy. Iris stood on the dock, watching them disappear into the vessels. Watching the ships pull away from their moorings, guided by tugboats into deeper water. The Statue of Liberty was visible in the distance, her green form catching the afternoon light like burnished gold. Iris wondered if the generals saw her, if they remembered that morning 14 months ago when they had first glimpsed her through lifting fog and understood that everything they had been told was a lie. The ships moved toward open water, their wakes glittering briefly before dissolving into the ordinary chaos of the harbor. And Iris realized that this part of her war was finally over. The decades that followed came to Iris in letters. She returned to Washington to intelligence work that felt mundane after translating transformation. She was promoted to captain, then major, then colonel. She married, briefly divorced amicably, and built a career on the understanding that the enemy is never as simple as you need them to be. But the letters kept coming. The first arrived in November 1946. Von Brenner's handwriting shaky but recognizable. Dear Lieutenant Ashford, I have found Elizabeth and our daughter alive. Dresden is destroyed beyond recognition, but they survived in a cellar living among strangers who shared what little they had. Elizabeth is thin in a way that frightens me. Our daughter does not remember what I look like. But we are together. I have planted an oak tree in the ruins of our garden, for Nathaniel, for William, for all who were lost, for the hope that understanding might grow where hatred fell. Iris wrote back, beginning a correspondence that would span decades. In 1950, von Brenner wrote that he had been asked to consult on the formation of the new West German military, the Bundeswehr. They want to build an army that serves democracy rather than threatens it. I tell them what America taught me, that soldiers must answer to civilians, that power constrained by choice is the only power worth having. They listen because I was there, because I saw what happens when military might serves ideology instead of people. In 1955, Reinhardt sent a newspaper clipping. He had opened a school in Munich teaching history, without propaganda, without lies, just evidence and the hard work of truth. The article included his photograph, older now, hair white, but his eyes carrying something they hadn't held during the war, peace maybe, or at least the absence of certainty's burden. In 1960, an unexpected letter arrived from Mrs. Carmichael. "Dear Lieutenant, that German general from the coffee visit came back to Algona, brought his whole family, his wife Elizabeth and daughter, and even a grandbaby. We stood at my Williams Memorial and he planted an oak tree there. Said something about growth and forgiveness. I thought you should know. Seems important somehow." The letters created a map of transformation that extended far beyond that initial 14 months. They documented the slow, patient work of men who had been defeated into wisdom, trying to build something better from the ruins of everything they had believed. Not all the letters brought good news. In 1963, word came that Vogel had died in East Germany, still clinging to his ideology, still insisting that the Reich had been betrayed rather than wrong. Some men, Iris understood, choose to break rather than transform. But most of the letters carried hope. Stories of former generals who became teachers, advisors, advocates for democratic reform. Men who used their military experience to argue for restraint rather than aggression. Who taught their children and grandchildren that strength comes in many forms and the loudest version is often the weakest. In 1985, 40 years after that morning when 60 German generals first saw New York Harbor and felt their world crack open, Iris received an invitation. Camp Algona had been converted into a museum. A reunion was being organized. Former prisoners of war and former guards, civilians who had helped, and translators who had witnessed it all. Iris was 68 years old now, retired from the army with a chest full of commendations and a lifetime of service. Her hair had gone white. Her hands showed the tremor of age. But when she read the invitation, she felt 28 again, standing on the deck of a ship watching enemies become students. She flew to Iowa in September. The museum was exactly where the camp had been, though the barracks had been replaced by exhibition halls and carefully preserved artifacts. Photographs lined the walls, uniforms behind glass, letters and documents, and the physical evidence of an experiment in what happens when you treat enemies as humans capable of change. Iris walked through the exhibits, slowly seeing her own history reflected back at her. There was the transcript of von Brenner's first interrogation, her handwriting in the margins translating key phrases. There was a photograph of the Christmas celebration, generals and guards singing together. There was even Reinhardt's wooden carving of an oak tree donated to the museum, along with a note explaining its significance. "Lieutenant Ashford." She turned. General Matthias von Brenner stood 10 feet away, 92 years old now, leaning on a cane but still carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had commanded divisions. His face was deeply lined, his hair completely white. But his eyes were the same eyes that had looked at her that first day on the ship and asked if New York was real. Beside him stood a woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes. Elizabeth, and a younger woman, maybe 50, who had to be their daughter. And 2 children, teenagers, looking around the museum with the polite boredom of young people dragged to family history events. Von Brenner crossed the space between them slowly, and when he reached Iris, he took her hand in both of his. "You came," he said in English that was now flawless, decades of practice smoothing away the accent that had marked him as foreign. "Of course I came," Iris replied. "I translated your transformation. I had to see what became of it." Elizabeth stepped forward, and Iris realized this woman had lived through Dresden's bombing, through starvation, through the long years of separation and uncertainty. She was smaller than Iris had imagined, but her handshake was firm. "Thank you," Elizabeth said simply, "for the letter, for making sure I knew he had not just survived but changed. It gave me hope when hope was hard to find." The daughter, who introduced herself as Greta, added, "My father taught me everything you taught him, about democracy, about the importance of questioning authority, about strength that doesn't require cruelty. I teach now too, carrying it forward." They stood together in the museum that had been a camp, surrounded by the documented evidence of transformation, and Iris felt the weight of 40 years settle around her like a blessing. The reunion ceremony was held that evening in the main exhibition hall. 50 people attended, Former prisoners, most quite elderly now. Former guards comparing stories and arthritis. Civilians who remembered when the camp had been part of their landscape. The museum director, a historian who had dedicated his career to preserving this story, stood to speak. What happened here was unusual, he began. Not just in this war, but in all wars. Enemies were treated with humanity. Prisoners were given not just food and shelter, but dignity and education. And as a result, many of them transformed. They went home and helped rebuild Germany, not as the power that started the war, but as a democracy that learned from defeat. He gestured to von Brenner and 3 other former generals in attendance. These men represent the success of that experiment. They used what they learned here to shape a better Germany. But they could not have learned without teachers. He turned to Iris and the handful of other translators and officers present. Without the people who chose to see enemies as humans capable of change. After the ceremony, they unveiled a new plaque at the museum entrance. Bronze simple engraved with words that von Brenner had helped compose. In this place, enemies became students. Ideology gave way to evidence. And 60 German generals learned that democracy's strength lies not in force, but in the choice to be humane, even to those who have forfeited the right to expect it. May all who visit remember the enemy is never as simple as we need them to be, and transformation is always possible for those brave enough to let truth in. The final event of the reunion was a tree planting, an oak sapling to be placed in the memorial garden where the old campyard had been. Von Brenner and Iris were given the honor of placing it in the ground together. As they knelt in the Iowa soil, their old bones protesting the effort, von Brenner spoke quietly. I have planted oak trees in 3 countries now. In Germany for Nathaniel and William and all the lost. In Arlington National Cemetery when I was invited to speak there in 1975. And now here where the transformation began. They covered the roots with earth, tamping it down, gently ensuring the young tree would have what it needed to grow. What do the trees mean to you? Iris asked. That we cannot undo what was done, cannot bring back the dead or erase the suffering. But we can plant something that will outlive us, that will grow slowly, patiently offering shade to people who will never know our names. He sat back on his heels, looking at the sapling. Growth is the only honest response to grief. They stood helping each other up, 2 old people who had been young together in a strange time. The sun was setting over Iowa, turning the sky orange and gold, and in that light the oak sapling looked both fragile and permanent. Small now, but containing within itself the possibility of decades of growth. Iris thought about Nathaniel, who had been dead for 40 years, but whose sacrifice had created the conditions for this moment. Thought about all the Williams and Elizabeths and nameless casualties whose suffering had paid for the lessons these men had learned. And she thought about the question that had haunted her since the beginning. Would Nathaniel understand what she had done translating for his killers? Witnessing their transformation, caring despite herself whether they succeeded in building something better? She thought he would, because Nathaniel had believed in a world worth fighting for. And that world required not just victory, but wisdom to know what to do with victory once you had it. That night in her hotel room, Iris wrote one final entry in the journal she had kept for 4 decades. Today I stood in Iowa with a German general I once hated, and we planted a tree together. We are both old now, too old to carry hatred with the intensity it requires. Time has worn us smooth, rounded our sharp edges, taught us that the enemy was never as simple as grief demanded. I lost Nathaniel 40 years ago. Von Brenner lost Elizabeth to starvation eventually, though not until 1978, and he got 32 more years with her than he thought he would. We have both buried people we loved. We have both lived longer than we expected. And standing in that museum, seeing the evidence of transformation documented and preserved, I realized something. I didn't translate just words during those 14 months. I translated one world into another. I stood at the boundary between hatred and understanding, between the simple story of good versus evil, and the complicated truth of humans learning to be better than their worst moments. That was my war. Not the one Nathaniel fought with bullets and sacrifice, but the one that came after. The war of deciding what to do with the enemy once you've defeated them. We chose to educate them, to show them evidence, to treat them humanely and let that humanity work its slow magic. And it worked. Not perfectly. Not for everyone. Vogel died as he lived clinging to lies, but von Brenner and Reinhardt and enough others transformed that it mattered. They went home and helped build a Germany that learned from its defeat. That tree we planted today will outlive both of us. Will grow tall and strong, offering shade to people who will never know about the camp or the generals or the young translator who stood between two languages trying to build bridges from wreckage. But it will grow, and that I think is enough. Nathaniel, if you can hear me, I hope you understand. I honored you not by hating your enemies forever, but by helping them become something better. By believing that even the worst of us can learn, can change, can plant trees in the ruins and hope for growth. The war is finally over for me. Not because the enemy was defeated, but because I learned to see the human in the enemy. To translate not just their words, but their transformation. And if that was my mission all along, then I have completed it. The oak will grow, the students will teach, the lessons will carry forward, and perhaps in some small way all the suffering will have meant something after all. Iris Cordelia Ashford died in 1998 at the age of 81. Her obituary in the Washington Post noted her distinguished career in Army intelligence, her role in prisoner of war programs, and her lifelong advocacy for humane treatment of captured enemy combatants. But it was the private memorial service that revealed the full scope of what she had done. Representatives from the German government attended, former students of Reinhardt's school. Greta von Brenner, now herself a grandmother who had flown from Munich to speak. Lieutenant Ashford, Greta said to the assembled mourners, translated more than language. She translated my father from a general who fought for evil into a man who spent 40 years trying to build good. She stood at the boundary between hatred and hope, and she chose hope, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Among Iris's papers, her family found thousands of letters, correspondence spanning 5 decades with former prisoners, their families, their students, their students' students. A web of connection that proved transformation was not a moment but a process that extended across generations. And they found her journals. 40 years of entries documenting the questions that never fully went away. The guilt and the hope and the terrible, complicated work of seeing enemies as humans. The final entry, written 2 weeks before her death, read simply, "The oak tree at Camp Algona is 40 feet tall now. Greta sent me a photograph, tall and strong and offering shade just as Matthias said it would. We did good work all those years ago. Work that mattered. I can rest now." The oak tree still stands in the memorial garden at the Camp Algona Museum. Visitors come from around the world to see the exhibits, to learn about the unusual experiment in treating enemies as humans capable of transformation. School groups tour the facilities, reading translated conversations between German generals and American officers. Reading letters that span decades, seeing photographs of Christmas celebrations where former enemies sang together. And they see the plaque, bronze and weathered now, but still legible. The words von Brenner and Iris composed together, offering wisdom earned through suffering. The enemy is never as simple as we need them to be, and transformation is always possible for those brave enough to let truth in. The oak provides shade for people who don't know the names of those who planted it, don't know about the young translator who lost her brother and chose understanding over hatred, don't know about the German general who learned that strength comes in many forms, and the loudest is often the weakest. But the tree grows regardless, tall and patient and permanent, a living reminder that even from the ashes of the worst humanity can do something good, can grow. If we are brave enough to plant it, if we are patient enough to nurture it, if we are wise enough to remember that the enemy once defeated can become the teacher who shows us what we're capable of becoming. The war ended in 1945, but the lessons are still growing. Reaching toward light, offering shade, teaching anyone willing to sit beneath their branches that transformation is never simple, never easy, but always, always possible.